Hi, please welcome Vonka. He's a senior developer and a manager, and he has 20 years and more experience with working with enterprise content management, and he's very skilled at what he's going to tell you now. And please keep your hands together for
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So, yeah, I could actually choose the title, but somebody else suggested the title. Exciting New Alfresco APIs. Obviously, the trick is how to make them exciting. I just want to say thanks very much to BeeCon for inviting me back. I did actually talk about APIs last year, about the future of the APIs. It took a little longer to get to where we are now, but I'm glad to say that we've 5 tools released in We did actually have regular community drops of a kind of early access late sort of during the summer last year and onwards, so that was good as well. So it's great to be here. So quick agenda. Actually, the talk was a 45-minute talk. When I looked on the agenda, it's actually only 30 minutes, so this is going to be a little tricky. So I may have to skip a few slides, and I don't think it's lightning talks afterwards, so I don't want to overrun. I also want to hopefully get a little demo in as well. So apologies if I start talking fast. You can ask a question to slow me down, or if I skip a few slides, I'll post them all afterwards. And there are some links in them, so hopefully you'll find a useful resource. And there are a few slides where you probably can't see some of the details, so hopefully that will be useful. So introduction. Name is Vonka, senior developer at Alfresco. I've been at Alfresco for many years, and as you probably saw from my introduction slides there, I'm a balloonist, so I enjoy flying hot air balloons. And I've got some other slides, especially the one from the last BeeCon on the slideshow there. The disclaimer slide, I will talk about a little bit about futures, so to keep everybody happy and product management don't tell me off. So there's a disclaimer, so things are subject to change. However, that's probably a good thing, because we've been talking about contributions and getting feedback, and it's really tricky sometimes to hear what you guys think are your top 3 key use cases or requirements. So hopefully that allows us to incrementally improve the APIs, and it's not really just about the APIs. I'd say it's much more about the services underneath, not only the existing Alfresco services that we want to expose, but hopefully new features as well. So please ask questions, contact me afterwards, talk to the product managers, particularly Richard and Ol, who are here. It would be great to hear your feedback and what we could do to improve. I think Thomas DeMario mentioned this morning, we've significantly increased the API footprint, but I think there's lots more to do still. So I wanted to give a quick overview, and actually one thing I wanted to ask was how many people have used the API Explorer? Okay, it's quite a few, that's good. So that kind of allows me to adjust a little bit in terms of people maybe new to this, and also hopefully provide some details for those who maybe have done this, used the APIs already. So you've probably seen this slide a few times. I think Thomas went through it quite a lot of detail this morning, so I won't go into too much. I just added there. I did change it slightly. A little bit of the text is different, especially at the top. It just doesn't just mention application development framework, it mentions other options as well. And this was my attempt at sort of taking that slide and just a little bit more detail, particularly around splitting the architecture in terms of, I use the word loosely here, microservices, but as you're aware, we're breaking up the architecture into more running parts, components, in particular processing content, search services, which also Mike was just talking about earlier. And in the middle there is the kind of the link in terms of the public remote API that we're talking about. Governance services are here, and I think in the long term, probably you might even see that broken out into a separate service eventually in terms of running the process. So that's just a quick overview. I guess the other thing to point out, I think Will Abson was doing a deep dive on the JavaScript API, which is a great option for using JavaScript, which is on the left there, JavaScript client binding. But you have other options. You can use the APIs directly, the HTTP APIs, or you can create your own bindings. An example, I think Jean-Marie's got an example, kind of early access of a Java client binding. He's using that specifically for the Android mobile client. But you could use it in other Java projects, and I'm sure he'd welcome more feedback on that. Or you can, and because we're using API spec, I'll mention a bit later on, you could potentially generate a first cut of your own binding. And we have one of my colleagues has been wanting to learn Python, so he's been doing a Python binding as a sort of an extra project, or you can use any other of your favorite languages. So you have lots of options. Some of you may or may not have seen this diagram before, but it's hard. I know this is one of the ones you won't be able to read, but hopefully when you're done.
Nobody's seen it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I'll put the slides up, you can download it. The thing to point out here is it sort of depicts the REST framework. Somebody mentioned that yesterday, Geffen might have mentioned it, I think. And in the top corner, which you can't see, but one thing to say is the APIs are built on top of the REST framework that is kind of internal, but it's open for use. And that REST framework sits on top of web scripts. In particular, there's 4 dynamic web scripts around get, put, post, and delete. And they're up on the left, and then there's an example of some of the significant improvements we added to 5.2 in terms of content services. That one, the example here is around the nodes API, and then at the bottom there, again, you can't see, is around the testing of that in terms of the embedded testing. But this REST framework was not just used for content services, it also was used for the private API that Will showed earlier around the content modeling. So the CMM that's exposed in Share, that private API is using the REST framework. And significantly, I'll be talking about a little bit more, is the governance services have added a whole bunch of new APIs, again, built on top of the REST framework. So in terms of the public V1 REST of the remote API, it's essentially it is, as you know, the APIs and the services that they expose are the enabler for the digital business platform that we've been talking about. And as I mentioned earlier, we'd like, as we go forward now, we'd like to hopefully drive some of the new features based on real client use cases. The API, the way we sort of design and develop the APIs, intended to be, API first. I think Thomas was talking about, and in a sense, contract first. So that does allow people to, even if they don't want to necessarily help us implement the APIs, they can help us define the API spec, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. In a sense, we talk about an open API. We want to be open with you guys as we develop it. We did that through the community EA program for 5.2, and I think the our own governance services are doing the same kind of thing. And by using the open API spec, which used to be Swagger, we can provide, and I think probably you heard the term a lot, is the word consistent. I think Geffen used it, and many other people use it. It helps us to provide a more consistent API. We have some internal guidelines. I think one of the things we'd like to do maybe publish. There is about a 40-page document. It's a little bit of a hard read, but we'd quite like to convert that into some kind of maybe a wiki markup that we could actually publish as an API design guide. The key things for us is that it's well documented in terms of reference. We've had lots of internal APIs in the past. We call it anomaly the V0 deprecated web scripts. They tend not to be very well documented. You tend to have to look at the implementation to understand what they were doing, and they were typically very inconsistent. So we have sort of a high-level docs from the docs team that provide a high-level introduction to all the APIs, but in terms of the API spec, it provides kind of reference material, and we've worked with the docs team. They've helped to review and helped us to ensure that it is consistent in terms of the way we describe and define the APIs. And the functionality is important. As I talk about, the API on its own is really nothing. It's about the services that it exposes. The other things we need to think about when we productize it and work with you guys to make sure it's real is it's got to perform, it's got to be secure, it's got to be reliable, and part of the reliability is the trust that the API will stay, and if we introduce new APIs, they're essentially incremental. And in terms of the span of the, or the footprint, I think Thomas called it, of the V1 API, that it is backwards compatible, so that gives people the chance to keep using and expanding. In terms of the, I mentioned the RESTful framework, the word REST, there's a debate, I don't want to get into the debate of how RESTful it is or not, but in a sense for us it's to be pragmatic, consistent, and well-defined. But it doesn't mean, one of the things is we may be missing some things that you need. And so there is an option to use the REST framework, and Geffen actually demonstrated that yesterday. And I put a link there, I've updated the slides to his quick API. He gave a quick example yesterday of, I think, exposing the categories using the REST framework. So if you want to have a look at that, and that may be a way of seeing how, if you don't want to look at all, for example, the significant features of 5.2 with the nodes API and the association gets quite complicated in terms of the code, but this would be a good example as an intro if you want to look at that first. A lot of people ask about CMIS, and CMIS is obviously open standard, but it's in a sense static, and it provides the features that it does, and it's still a really good option. It may be used, for example, heterogeneous can't say that, heterogeneous environments. And the I stands for interoperability. And the REST APIs, and particularly for the content services, are still compatible with CMIS. You can use the node IDs, and you could use a mixture if you really wish to. So that's still an option. And obviously, if we don't provide what you need, you still have the option to roll your own. Although what I would say is if you're doing that's great, but it would be great to hear your feedback about if these are key use cases and you felt it should be part of, I use the word loosely here, core. It'd be great if we could understand how you're using custom web scripts, whether they're built on the REST framework or not. So maybe we could look at prioritizing those in the future. This slide was, I've seen, I think Thomas had a slide with a triplet of 3. I tried to add in search services, so there's 4 here. Process, we talked about 1.6, and I think they've been talked about the V6, the core activity engine. Governance, in particular 2.6 is coming. I'll mention that a little bit later on, but I think there's already nightly builds. I think there's a community drop of reference management 2.6 possibly in the next month. Today? Oh, there you go. Perfect.
Announced this morning.
Oh, excellent. I thought it was within a month. There you go, within a day. And then I believe the Enterprise Edition is possibly in the November timeframe. So Content 5.2 that some of this talk is partly focusing on, and Search Services 1.0 in terms of built on top of Server 6. In terms of the platform as a whole, obviously this is driven by applications, particularly interested in those built on ADF or otherwise, custom applications. It's also about integrations, and I sort of put in loosely here, pick and mix. You know, people aren't necessarily going to write an application that covers everything. We'll do the great demo of healthcare demo app, and sort of look at like case management style or combining process and content. But really, in theory, you could hopefully use those services and APIs that you need either to integrate with other systems or to build, a whole application. The trick, I guess, and that's why I put the word context here, is there's various levels of context that will affect how you do, maybe less on the integration side, because that might be done through an admin, but particularly around clients, is you kind of need to know what's configured. Particularly if you're building these clients across multiple versions, we would like to extend this footprint, and we want to introduce incremental new features. But that does imply, as we go up, provide new community drops and new service packs, there will be new features, and if you wish to make use of those features, you need to know whether you wish to still continue to support the previous service pack or the previous community milestone. So in some cases, you may want to get more advanced and actually degrade some functionality based on those features. And there is some differentiation between enterprise and core, and I'll mention a little bit more about that as well. So it does make sense in some cases to know that you're running enterprise or core community. Similarly for end users, for users and groups, obviously we know about permissions and things, but there's other context. In particular, quite a few of the APIs are admin only, and we describe those quite clearly. They're admin-based APIs, but you need to know that when you're building. Your client may actually be more of an admin client, or in some cases you may wish to use the same client, but it switches based on the role. And other examples are things like managers, site managers, or record managers. And then permissions, particularly around allowable operations and the permissions you have, your UI is going to adjust to that context. I didn't want to spend too long on this slide. People are new to this, particularly the top part has been described before. I think there's Tech Talk Lives and there's some introduction material. So I'll kind of skip a little bit of the top part of the URL. That's defined by our guidelines and kind of RESTful framework. In particular, the B1, we essentially we're versioning the API as a whole. It really isn't around the version of the features, it's around the style of API. It's kind of the style of the requests and responses. If we wanted to, in the future, change that because we felt we could provide something that was more performant or just a different kind of style, we're not going to in the foreseeable future, but that might be an option for us to bump up the number and then deprecate the B1 public APIs. So that's the important thing around. It's not really about the whole API, it's about the particular services and endpoints. I put an example here around sort of get the CRUD of the API, create, retrieve, update, and delete. Maps onto get post, and this is the kind of the framework. Not all of these map onto the nodes. I mean, you could the entity here is nodes. There's a big significant difference in 5.2. We provide nodes in terms of files and folders, but also in terms of custom types, custom aspects, generally containers. But you could also look at that entity, and there's lots of other examples of entities. Another example would be sites that might map across here. You have sites and site ID, and in terms of the relationships, you might have site membership. Here for the nodes, I'm using children in terms of the parent-child container structure. But so in that example there, get on the nodes, we actually don't support get on nodes because that would be kind of all your nodes. But get on listing sites, we do that. So it depends on the specific entity whether we support all the operation, all the methods. But one of the big changes for 5.2 has been we were limited a little bit as how everything we could map onto entities and relationships. One significant piece which is used in specific areas is the idea of an operation on the end of the URL. Now, this doesn't mean that the operation has to be uniquely named and not conflict with a relationship, but the example here is copy. You know, you want to copy a node or move a node, and there are other examples of locking or in terms of RM, and maybe declaring a record or other kinds of what we term operations. So, you know, there could be an argument as to how RESTful that is, but we would, in this case, we use post as a way of copy because we're creating a new entity. But the operations use a post mechanism. It could have been put, we decided to use post. So if you're interested in any of the details on this and I haven't covered it, then let me know afterwards and we can go into more detail. So I just want to quickly mention documentation. I think quite a few people put their hands up about having to use the API Explorer, so I won't spend so long on this. I'm doing it for time. But in a sense, the API Explorer is your friend. We want to use the API specs for all the different projects and services as the source of truth in terms of the contract, the API first contract. So please, if you haven't had a chance to look at this, there's a live sandbox. I'll put the URL there, but you can actually deploy the Explorer in terms of content services, the same for governance, process as well. I'll show you a couple of screenshots. They also have some of it. I'm not sure we've done it for the core process engine yet, or activity. I assume we will soon. And by having the API spec, it allows people to have the option to generate a first card client bindings as well. It won't give you everything, because we have certain things in our framework that don't necessarily map onto API spec. But one of the things is I know there's a new version of API spec with, I think, V2. We'll have a look at V3 and see what's been added. So I've got 12 minutes here, so it's going to be tricky to get a demo in, but I'll kind of whiz through. This is an example of the API spec for core content services. There's a drop down on the left. I won't demo it live. I was going to maybe show you live, but you can go to the URL and just play with it yourself. And there's an example of all the various entities and relationships for content services, 5.2. Similarly for process services, the example of some of the context in terms of enterprise. I don't believe there's one for the engine, so I've just put the list there, but hopefully we'll have one for the engine as well, in terms of the core engine. And similarly for governance, this is coming soon, although this left-hand side is available today. And the community drop of RM. So again, the same idea. There's, in terms of docs, there's the high-level docs, but there's also Gavin Cornwell's done a very, very detailed walkthrough. So if my demo is rushed today, I've got some Postman collections you can download. If you really want to have a walkthrough, some of that will be covered by Gav's blog post, and he's got collections on each of these, each article in the series. All the links will be available by the slides, but also what I've been trying to do on the community is put together kind of a cheat sheet with all various links to all sorts of other material. It normally is called 5.2 REST APIs, and I'm wondering maybe we'll change it to the REST APIs more generally. So in terms of what's new and changed, these are the slides I'm going to have to cut down from 45 minutes to 30, but they're there for reference. They just go into a little bit more detail, some things I've been mentioning already. So as we mentioned, there's a big significant new footprint in terms of content services, like 56 new endpoints, but particularly in terms of the core API, if you use the drop-downs, have a look at nodes, associations, that kind of thing, and that'll give you a feel. You can also look at sites. One of the features we've introduced is the ability to create a full-blown site, and I think we'll show that in the healthcare app. You could use the site as a container, or a couple of levels of container. You can use the document libraries container or other kind of site containers. And some people might find that useful if they want to have them site membership concept. So it's not necessarily just share only. The REST framework we've enhanced, and I think we want to do more on that. And a lot of this, if you enjoyed Will's talk about the JavaScript API, what you may find is this is complementary. You can stay at the JavaScript level, but if you want to see a little bit under the covers, and also help Will and the rest of the team expand that unified API, then you may find it might be not useful to dip into both, using the kind of low-level calls as well as the JavaScript calls. And one thing I should add on the on the REST framework, some of the changes I mentioned operations already. We needed to add some stuff around unauthenticated access in very limited cases, shared links, quick share links as an example. But one of the other things we added in terms of both expanding the response, so we're trying to return back things consistently, but in a kind of a minimal, useful format, we hope, and we can get feedback on that. But in many cases, there's additional lookups you can do. So there's a way of including something that's not kind of open API spec standard, but it allows us to, it's a little bit more like OData, where you can expand and contract the request and responses. And then another thing too, a bit like the field list that Michael showed for Solar FL, we have a fields parameter that allows you to cut the response down if you want to sort of tune your responses. Some curl, lots of curl, Will showed lots of that. If you want to use the API Explorer, it gives you examples of using the curl. I put this in because there's one thing the API Explorer can't do, is to do the multi-part form upload of just a binary piece of content. So you probably can't read it, but the first one is just showing how you can on the command line just upload some content. And that's a little bit tricky with the API Explorer unless you're using text files, so that might be useful. I won't go through each of these, but there's about 5 slides that just kind of go a little bit more detail around entities. This one was the one I was giving an example of nodes and associations, so let me go through that, and if at the end we've got time, we can come back. The core API, nodes, trash can, some pre-configured queries. If you're not using advanced search, this is more like the live search, if you just want to type and get some results. But if the pre-configured queries aren't enough, you can then drop into the full-blown search service API, which is a little bit different from the REST framework because it's a more complex API, so it's all in one. You can post in a very complex post body and then get back quite a complex response, but you have to kind of read the docs, understand all the options you've got. So that's a slightly different style API. And shared links 5.2 is around quick share. One of the things we did add as some features, we'd like to add more. This one had expiry, and I did notice one of the talks here at BeeCon, there was an add-on around adding an expiry feature. There's those kinds of things that we could improve on some of our existing services, so this is something that's new in 5.2. Tickets, some people show, I think Will showed some of that. And a little bit of discovery, but I think we could do more here. So I'd be interested in your feedback around discovery and the search API that I just mentioned. Some enhancements to existing APIs that were there from 4.2 to 5.1, and particularly you can now create a site, which is handy if you're using sites, and still using share as well. Demo, right. Very quick demo, I hope to give you a flavour. Let's switch. This is when the screen doesn't work. There's a trick to mirroring these, isn't there?
Command brightness down.
Command brightness down. Oh, ah, yeah, well done. It was there, wasn't it? Thank you. I need to remember that. Great, great tip. Oh, thank you. Is that full screen? Okay, it's a little bit big, but so people who haven't used Postman, please have a look. It's worth. That's not quite. Please. I zoom out.
Option maximize.
Mm-hmm. Which one's the maximize?
The green one at the top will make it. Oh.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And now, this is going to be a demo fail. I'm losing the. Oh, there you go. Hopefully it's going to work very well. I lost the. On the full screen, it was easy.
And last time we'll zoom out.
No, it's more. It's brought up a separate window.
Yeah, it's just because it's responsive. So if you zoom out, it'll come back on the side.
Can I zoom out with? I thought it was command minus. Ah. Thank you. There you go. Perfect. Thank you. So this collection is available. So apologies. I've got 5 minutes. I'll do a couple of them, and then hopefully answer. Time for a question or two. But if you were interested in walking through more of these, then you can do it yourself, or I can. Thank you. Catch up. So the example here was actually I did it running earlier, but I think I've removed the person. It's just creating a person. So this is using admin and the URL here is, the thing with Postman is you can have different environments. This is running against my local host, but with these variable replacements, you can actually run exactly the same commands against the sandbox that I mentioned, the API Explorer sandbox, and you can access it through CMIS as well. Or, what most of you guys hopefully will do is actually get it running locally and then run it against your local instance. So here was an example of the base URL, which is kind of that long URL, well, the environment details you see actually both pop up there, localhost, and then the rest of it for people. So it's creating a person, we can list people. So somebody's asked a favour. This was running as admin, but now this is the login, create a ticket using username and password. And what Postman does, it allows it just to extract, using a script here, it can extract a few of the some information from the response, and we can then use that in subsequent calls. Now, you could do the same thing with curl, and although Will showed that as you build up more and more shell, it's a script, you get a very long curl script. But as a way of learning, it's a good mechanism, and also for admins and other people, it's a good option if you're not building a full client. So it gives you a way of learning the API, and then hopefully giving us feedback to how we can improve it. That ticket was stored in a variable, so now for subsequent calls, that ticket's being actually passed in as part of the authorization there. So this is now ticket-based calls, so we're not doing another authentication. So in this idea here was to create a folder. One of the things that is an example of the REST framework is here what I mentioned about reducing the amount in the response. Here I'm just going to ask just back for the ID of the folder. Comes back with the ID, and normally you get back some more information. So in terms of that folder, I can upload, and Postman you can actually upload some images. So I can upload a binary, which is the shuttle. There's some metadata about that that's set up. And here again, when I'm listing the children, I think I'm asking for, that's creating, okay, later on I'll show you. And I can also upload a text file here. And then in terms of retrieving the content, we can retrieve, there's a basically, given the node ID, there's a /content on the end. You can get back to the image that I've just uploaded. In terms of the text, again, I stored the ID of the node here, so we can get back to the text about the Space Shuttle engines. We can list children. These were put into a shuttle folder. Oops, I made a mistake here in the collection. Oops. So this is the kind of thing you can do when you're changing your save that in the collection. So yeah, there's listing 2 items. We uploaded the 2. Both the text, and you could upload custom content, and also apply custom aspects. And I think Will showed that in terms of healthcare. Here's a list children with a lot more parameters. So you can get, once it's built, once you have a client binding, this becomes easier. But I don't know if you can see that very well. But I've added not all the options, but a few here. For example, we're doing, given a user's home folder, we can go and look in a relative path. I know in this case the actually I think I renamed the folder, so there's another correction here. Shuttle. Not sure that works, yeah. So, and then I've got a skip count and paging. Normally you get a default page. Here I've got some, you can change the paging. I've got an ordering by CM name. You can order by custom properties. I've got descending. And then there's a where clause. And it depends on the API. For listing collections, this is not a query language, but it allows some level of filtering. And each API can support some aspects of, potentially each API can support some aspects of the so-called where. It's just a way of us providing a consistent API. So it's not necessarily exactly the same as the SQL where that Michael was showing, or similarly, it's not necessarily exactly the same as the CMI's query language. It allows us to filter, so in this case, I was doing where is file equals true, but you can actually go node type. Node type is CM content, or node type, including all subtypes as well, of either marker aspect types or other things. And so, and here we've got an include, so we'll also bring back the properties and aspects of each thing. And one of the secret little features here, which we'd like to improve the framework on, is a thing called relations. That's always been there. It allows you to get related items, and particularly here I'm getting the renditions that were generated for these items. It's something we want to work more on, because if you had a collection that was really large, this isn't really going to work. So what we want to do is allow you to do an extra related items, but also put more filtering on those as well. So that's one area where we can improve the REST framework. Other ways, it's a way of aggregating results, and other ways of doing that would be batch kind of mechanisms. So I mentioned listing renditions on the image, retrieving the content of a rendition. This was the shuttle that I uploaded, etc. So I'm just kind of walking through here, but if you look at the collection in detail, you can see it's quite easy to use as a sort of test environment, dev environment. uploading new versions. So here I can pick another version of the image. This is the shuffle 2. And if I get back the content here, the shuffle's just taking off, and I get another version. I just whiz through this, pick another copy of the image. And this could be Word docs or PowerPoints or any other content. I'm just using images because they're easy to see. Shuffle almost there, and I'll do one more. Uploading the 4th version. So this is kind of the version part of the API. And so it's 4 images of the shuttle, and then, if, for example, we can get back here, for example, there's node/versions, and again, you can cut down the version list with paging if you want, but here there's 4 versions of those that I just uploaded. So I'm going to run out of time, so there's a few more here around creating sites, deleting sites, track plan. It's just a flavor, and if you go through the API Explorer, you can use that, and you can run that directly. There's a try now button, so you can use that directly. You can use curl, you can use Postman, or you can start building your own clients. Use the JavaScript API. There's lots of options for learning and helping us to improve the API. So let's see. So if I do, what's the magic command that we're using? Up brightness.
Brightness down.
To switch again.
Yeah. Brightness up makes it redetect the displays. So if you're having a hard time seeing it on the screen.
Thank you. Yeah, so there's the link to the collection that I was just going through. And this was a slightly old screenshot. This was an example of an internal prototype around simple file sharing that was using all of the new APIs. This is being, I haven't got an up-to-date screenshot, I think there's a new one that's coming along with built on ADF as well. So I just didn't get a chance to find a screenshot, so I'm just using the old one. But it kind of just gives an example of some things I just walked through, but you can build a fairly simple file sharing client with the content service API, and there's a lot more options. This is a full-featured client that was running live internally within our Fresco as a prototype. I've mentioned the client bindings and examples of that. So, for example, yeah, we talked about healthcare app, and Will did a great demo earlier. I've mentioned the Java client as an early access, and I think John Marie would love to have some feedback on that if you find that useful. Or key thing for us is to obviously work with you guys to see how we can build new integrations and new clients. So I mentioned the Python binding as an example. So what's next? Futures. Have I still got a minute to talk about futures? Thank you. So some of this is shorter term and longer term. This is where PM's going to hide. So I know there's questions about, I can't commit to this, but I know that we've done a lot of work around group management. It didn't quite make it in time for 5.2, but I'm hoping for the next, hopefully the next drop of community for content services, and then the 5.2.1 service pack. Those things like group management. There's also things around downloading a zip. And then it gets a little more vague. We've got lots of ideas, and we'd love to get them in some sort of order. And I'm sure if you guys talk to Richard and Ol, we can get them in the right kind of priority order. So there's been discussions around auditing, repository actions, avatar management in terms of profile picture, just to build a full client. In the past, we talked about things, other existing services, even possibly things like check and checkout, and the list goes on. Governance, I mentioned, they're bringing out where it's actually available in terms of the core governance services API, and then in terms of enterprise, which is the classification guide for security controls. I haven't got an update on the process side, so apologies for that, but I'm sure there's new things to be added there. In terms of REST framework, there could be incremental improvements. Batch would be a good example, although you can kind of get away with it doing transactional batch or some async batch as well would be good. Some of that's based on how we implement queues in the future. But there's other improvements to the REST framework. One of the limitations of it is you can't really return back a different response to the request. The entities kind of expect you to have, and that's kind of limiting. If you're using something like Drop Wizard or Spring Boot, you don't have that limitation. So, I'm not sure how high up in the priority list it is, but I think if people building some custom APIs, and I think for us there's also a couple of places where it would be nice to be able to have things like that. It's not on the slide, but I think if people are interested in that, can talk to me. And then some of the things I think Brian may or may not have mentioned, or we want to explain, this is where it gets a little hazy, but actually I think it's critical for the API and the services is around being able to call back and expose event streams, some changelog, a bit like CMS has a changelog, provide more, and then in terms of callbacks, have the option to have a potentially either a webhook where you subscribe or server-side sent events. So if anybody wants to talk about that, I'd be interested to hear what you think we should do. And that's the other thing with the futures is now's a really, really good time to talk to us, because now 5.2's out and provides a foundation. I think we want to do a lot more. So I'd be interested to hear your key use cases. Is there any way if you're building some custom things that we could learn from that, and if it's generally applicable, we may have the option to improve either existing services or add more. And I think Rich mentioned it yesterday, we are moving to Git in terms of the content service. Some of the projects already are in Git, and that may help us to make it a little easier to work with you guys in terms of if you're interested in contributing, not in terms of just the API spec, but in terms of actual implementation. The challenge there is there's a lot to do, so that I know it doesn't always work for everybody. It's not just the implementation code, it's a lot what the spec, I think maybe is the one that's definitely feasible implementation code, of course. Then the trick is all the tests that go with that, and then for us to roll it out as a fully supported feature. But definitely for any incremental enhancements we can do it, so let me know. So I wouldn't really have time for the summary, but really I just put in some references for you. Hopefully that's covered.
Okay, since we are far over time, we can do only one question. Does anyone have a question for Jan? Okay.
Will showed some content types being uploaded and noted that that was a private API, and I wondered, is the being able to import content types and things like that going to be in the public API at any point?
In terms of model management?
Yeah, and if not, is CMS type mutability a decent workaround, or I can't remember whether that's working or not.
Well, definitely I've seen it on the list. It didn't make 5.2. Having said that, the CMM is there. It does provide an option to upload a dynamic model. So in that sense, it's a dynamic model. So that has the limitations. Those dynamic models have to be incremental. I think in the future, and that's future, we could, I mean, I wrote that original thing a long time ago, and we didn't really get that much feedback on it, so I made it very strict. And since then, over time, I've be more convinced that we could be more lenient, because as a developer, depending if it's a production system or development system, for developers it'd be nice if you could make that mutability more lenient, and where things, essentially some things where you don't have the content property, for example, it disappears, it essentially becomes residual, but there's some issues that may impact your application. So, but I think in terms of model management, yes, that was on the list to make it a public feature.
Thank you. Put your hands together for Jan, please.